All right, this is Concept 1 notes of our Support and Motion unit in our Anatomy and Physiology curriculum, and we're going to be talking about the skeletal system. So just a brief overview, bone is a rigid, but it is a living organ, which is something that it often comes to be counterintuitive to most people's thinking. It is made up of all four types of tissues. Remember, organs are groups of two or more tissues working together for a common function, and bone actually has all four types of tissue in it. So, the majority of bone is connective tissue, it's osseous tissue, but cartilage and dense connective tissues are other connective tissues that cover the bone's external surface and play a big role in the skeletal system. Nervous tissue is there too. There are nerves that innervate bone and that are really important for signaling, which we'll discuss a little bit in concept 3 when we talk about the muscular system and movement. Epithelial tissue, it's in your blood vessels, which are in your bones. They provide nourishment of all the things your bone needs to function. And then muscle tissue, skeletal muscle tissue, that is covering joints and connecting bones and making movement possible. So all of these things we'll be talking about throughout this entire unit. And there's a really cool little video clip I'll show you if you're in my class that is little 3 minutes. What would it be like if we didn't have bones? It's kind of funny. Because your body has over 206 bones. Almost 1/5 of a healthy person's body weight is just their skeletal system, which is pretty crazy. This isn't just your bones. We're referring to the cartilage, your ligaments, your joints. All of those things are part of your skeletal system. And your skeleton is constantly rebuilding itself. You're actually getting a whole new skeleton about every 7 to 10 years. And we'll talk about that remodeling process towards the end of the notes. A couple other reasons why your skeletal system is awesome, and it's not just like this silly skeleton or some sort of mascot for Halloween. All other parts of your body would collapse without your skeleton. That's how important they are. We don't have to worry about our delicate organs. Like, imagine your brain if it didn't have a skull protecting it, if it was just exposed. Like, you couldn't play football even with a helmet. There's so many things you couldn't do, but our skeleton provides some amazing protection. And it can repair itself once it's been damaged, which again, we'll talk about kind of towards the end of these notes. So, functions of the skeletal system. It's so much more than you think. One is, of course, support. It is the framework holding up the entire body. Another is protection, as you can see in this picture here. It's guarding the body's most vital organs, like your skull protecting the brain and your rib cage, which protects your heart and lungs. And then, of course, movement. Skeletal muscles are connected to bones via tendons, and we use bones as levers at joints to produce movements, which we'll get into more in concepts 2 and 3. But these three things people don't often think of, and these are incredibly important functions too. Storage, for one. Your bones store minerals like calcium and phosphate, which can be released into the blood when we need them, and that's really important. They store energy in the form of fat and yellow bone marrow. Also, blood cells are formed in our bones, and hematopoiesis. In our red bone marrow of certain bones, hematopoiesis is happening. And then hormones are also produced in our bones in some ways, and which are critical for helping to maintain homeostasis. For example, your bones help produce osteocalcin, which regulates insulin secretion, which would help with glucose regulation and, of course, energy usage. And it helps regulate our blood calcium levels because your bones store calcium. And we'll get into more of the hormone production component when we talk about the endocrine system in our next unit. All right, so in my class now, we are going to stop and I'm going to let you learn more about the skeletal system yourself and all of the different bones. But for the sake of this video, we're going to keep trucking along. So, classification. Bones are classified usually by their location. So if they're in the axial skeleton or the appendicular skeletons, which you just learned about in the discovery stations, or by their shape. And a bone's shape dictates its function. Remember, this is a common theme of anatomy and physiology. The shape of something determines its function. And we see that with these 4 different shapes. So long bones, short bones, flat bones, and irregularly shaped bones. So we're going to talk about each one briefly. Long bones are longer than they are wide. They tend to have a long shaft with either end being a bit wider, like we see in this picture. Most of your long bones are located in your limbs and they act as levers to aid in movement. So, example, your arm bones, like your humerus, radius, and ulna, the bones of your hand, even though they're small, they're still classified as long because the shaft is longer than they are wide. Your leg bones and your foot bones, these are all long bones. All right, well, short bones, these are more cube shaped. They tend to be about as wide as they are long, and they provide support and stability with little movement, so much different from the long bones. So your carpals, which are in your wrists, your tarsals, which are in your ankles, these are all types of short bones. And then there's a special type of short bone that looks like a sesame seed called a sesamoid bone, and it's called that because of its shape, and these are embedded within your tendons. Probably the one you would be most familiar with is your kneecap, which is your patella, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. All right, flat bones. These are thin and flat, and they often have a bit of a curve to them. They have a large surface area because they attach largely to muscles. So, for example, your breastbone, your sternum, your shoulder blades, which are called your scapula. So those have some major muscles attached to them. Your ribs, most of the cranial bones, in your skull are also flat bones. So we'll see that in the discovery stations for the skeletal system, but also you'll kind of see that when we talk about the muscular system too in concept 3. And then irregular bones is basically everything else. These are irregularly shaped because they're highly specialized in their structure, and thus their shape has to be highly specialized too. So examples, your hip bones, as we can see here in your pelvic girdle. I mean, that is a crazy shape there. But they specialize for so many things, where your legs, basically attaching the appendicular and axial skeletons together, and there's so many organs in there too. And then your vertebrae, here's kind of an interesting angle of a vertebrae, but they have an interesting shape as well. And you'll get to read about your vertebral column in the discovery stations. All right, let's talk about bone structure. So, despite the variety in the overall shape of bones, most bones in general, again, this is a generalization, but they have the same basic internal structure. And we're going to look specifically at a long bone here. But in general, there is a dense and smooth layer of compact or cortical bone tissue on the outside, surrounding a more porous, spongy bone tissue on the inside that we see here. So we've kind of got this compact bone and then this spongy, more porous bone here. And then look at all these other things we'll talk about as well. About 22% of your bone is actually water too, which is interesting. And the structure is so detailed and it's so fascinating and really special because it makes the bone incredibly strong. Think like metals like steel that are used to construct buildings that have to be so strong. But your bones are also really lightweight. Think of a metal like aluminum. It's super lightweight and somewhat flexible too. So it's a really unique structure, which makes sense that it would be then a little bit complex. So there's the compact bone pictured there, and then there's some spongy bone pictured in this. All right, let's talk about that compact bone specifically. So we're going to zoom in on this kind of outside layer here. What is going on there? Your compact bone is made of something called osteons. They are the basic structural unit of compact bone. They're like long cylinders that act as tiny weight-bearing pillars in your bone. So this whole thing, that's like an osteon. And they're made of hollow tubes called lamella. Okay, so these are the different tubes called lamella. And those are filled with tiny salts and collagen fibers that allow the bone to resist torsion stress, so like twisting of your bone. It can resist that kind of stress. And then we have your central canal, which runs through the middle of each osteon. That's what we kind of see here. And it contains small blood vessels that are providing nourishment, and then also your nerve fibers that are critical for signaling. So in this picture on the left, we're looking at kind of We're zooming in on compact bone, and we can see multiple osteons from an angle. So here's an osteon, here's an osteon, here's one, here's one. So we're kind of just looking at them from a couple angles. On the right, that's just one osteon. So this would just be one kind of zoomed in. You can see the layers of lamella, or lamellae in plural. That's what we can see pictured here. And then we see the central canal. We see the nerves running through it, arteries, veins, vessels, etc., which we'll talk more about in our transport unit as well. So all of this stuff, we're going to keep circling back to these things because these units are so intertwined. All right, let's talk about this spongy bone. So if we go back to that original picture, we're going to zoom in on this part right here. All right, it's a spongy bone. It's less organized than the compact bone. That is an extremely organized and rigid structure. This one's a little bit less organized. There are not osteons. Instead, it has trabeculae, which are tiny bone struts. You can see them zoomed in here that are key for helping the bone to resist stress. And it's also where your bone marrow is. You can see it pictured there. Remember, your red bone marrow makes your blood cells, and your yellow bone marrow stores energy in the form of fat. So bone marrow is really important, and we can find it here in the trabeculae of the spongy bone. All right. Now, looking at the outside of a bone, if you were to hold a specimen or a sample of a bone, you would see that it's rarely smooth. Most bones have distinct bone markings that correspond to how the bone and its attached muscles and ligaments are working together. So 3 types of bone markings we often see are projections where muscle and ligaments attach, surfaces that form joints, like we can see some surfaces here. You can see some projections kind of like in these where there are these almost, these depressions and openings for blood vessels and nerves. We can kind of see those here in the skull. And then kind of these projections where muscles and stuff can attach in the jaw. So those are all different types of bone markings. And what we're going to do in my class is stop and really look at the structure of bone a little bit more so you can understand it. But again, for the sake of the video, we're going to keep pressing forward. So let's talk about bone cells, because those were labeled in some of my previous diagrams, and I want to talk about the 3 main ones. There's also osteoprogenitor or osteogenic cells that are kind of like the bone stem cells, but we're not going to talk about those in detail here. We're going to talk about osteocytes, osteoclasts, and osteoblasts. So osteocytes are maintaining healthy bone structure. Remember we said your skeleton is basically remodeling itself every 7 to 10 years. So we have, in its entirety, it's constantly remodeling, but the whole thing is basically replaced every 7 to 10 years. So osteocytes are critical for that. And they are mainly housed in lacunae, which are the gaps between the lamella, or the lamellae, if you say it in plural. So think of them like foremen at a construction site. They're monitoring, they're maintaining quality, they're commanding the workers, which in our analogy here would be our osteoblasts and osteoclasts, and they're responding to stimuli. Like if they sense stress or strain, or the opposite of that, the lack of stress or strain, like astronauts experience in outer space in zero gravity situations. That's what the osteocytes are doing. They're monitoring all of that. The osteoblasts, think blast, build. These are the ones that are really building and constructing bones by calcifying bone as it forms and really making it hard. And then the osteoclasts are also critical players in the regeneration of bone through bone remodeling. They do a lot of absorbing bone tissue wherever it's not needed or wherever it's degenerating. There's also bone lining cells too. I did not mention that. That those are really important. They're on the bone surface, and but we're not going to go into details. These are the 3 I really, really want you to understand. When stimulated, also some osteoblasts can become osteocytes. So that's kind of something interesting too. But each of these are critical in bone formation and bone remodeling. So ossification or osteogenesis is the process of bone tissue formation, and it's so key for forming your skeleton as an embryo. Beginning at week 8 of the pregnancy or gestational process, however you want to describe it. Again, we'll talk more about this in our reproduction and development unit. It'll be our last one. But just even at week 8, the embryo is starting to form a skeleton through this process. And this is also essential, your bone growth from childhood all the way up until early adulthood, this is happening. And then later in life, this process is not really forming skeleton as much as it's just remodeling and repairing skeleton. So the two main types are intramembranous ossification, which is when the bone develops from a fibrous membrane. So a fibrous membrane then is going to be ossified into a membranous bone. So this is like how your clavicle and your skull bones are formed. I think about when, sorry, not even going to explain that example. It's not really that helpful. So the other one is endochondral ossification, when bone develops by replacing cartilage, which yields endochondral bone. This is basically how the majority of your bones are. Cartilage does remain, though, in your body. You have cartilage in your body. There's articular cartilage on the ends of bones, and then there's epiphyseal plates. Excuse me, it's early, which is where bone growth comes from as bones elongate. So there is cartilage still in your body, but the endochondral ossification is replacing a lot of cartilage. And I have a really great, this is what I was trying to get out earlier, but I am not being very coherent this morning, 6-minute video that's going to explain this process in more detail if you're in my class. Which is really important. In the womb, though, as an embryo, I think it's super fascinating. Your osteoblasts, cartilage develop first, and then your osteoblasts are coming in. They're building bone from that existing cartilage by adding collagen and calcium phosphate to it to make it harder and harder. And it's pretty cool. I'm actually 20 weeks pregnant, and we just had our anatomy scan where they do kind of like an in-depth ultrasound, and just seeing the intricacy of the baby's skeleton and all of these things, like the vertebral column already, is truly, truly fascinating. And it's crazy that it starts as early as week 8. All right, last thing-ish we're going to talk about is bone remodeling. So your bone is constantly being remodeled. Think back to Biology 1 when we talked about mitosis, and we talked about how your body cells are constantly regenerating for growth, but especially for repair too. That's how bone is. Your bone is doing the same thing. Your body is constantly maintaining itself. And this is super important because if your bone wasn't constantly being remodeled, the calcium in your bones would crystallize, and it would make your bones more brittle, which makes them more likely to fracture. And this is something we see in the aging process, is that we're not remodeling as efficiently, and thus our bones get more brittle, and so thus fractures can be much more common. So the general process, I'm not caring that y'all know this in insane detail, but I do want you to know your osteocytes basically release chemical signals. Remember, they're like the construction foreman, and they're telling your osteoclasts, okay, go to the damage. Your osteoclasts get there, and they release enzymes there that allow them to then digest the calcium phosphate. And then they take that calcium and phosphate, and they put it back in the blood. It's resorption, so it's not wasted. It goes back in the blood. Macrophages are promoting bone tissue remodeling, so they're a type of cell that are there as well. And then your osteoblasts come in and build new bone before then undergoing apoptosis. So this is kind of a diagram summarizing that. And every year, about 5 to 10% of your skeleton is being replaced through this process, so that over the course of 7 to 10 years, the whole thing is basically made new. And one thing that's really interesting is exercise actually stimulates this bone remodeling process, and thus it makes your bones stronger. You're not just building muscle when you exercise, you're making your bones stronger. And that's because exercise puts stress on your bones. And stress is a signal that your osteocytes basically take in. They respond to that stimuli of stress, and they think, okay, we need to get our osteoclast to work here. So working out is building both bone and muscle, which is why it's really important. Exercise is super good for you all throughout your life. So let's talk about if damage does occur, because of course it will. A fracture is basically just a break in your bone, and there are so many different types and so many different ways that people classify them or name them. So here's kind of a picture just covering a couple. Here we see a fracture in the left clavicle bone, which really is it's a clean break right there. It would be classified as an open or compound fracture. But treatment, how do we treat these? The two main things we're going to do is we're going to reduce and we're going to immobilize. So reduction is basically realign the broken bone ends and then immobilize them. Keep them stable and in place so that they have time to heal themselves. Your body is amazing at healing itself. So how does it repair that in detail? Well, first, hematoma forms due to hemorrhage blood clots, which you can see. So when your bone breaks, there's blood clots that are hemorrhaging because of the blood vessels that are in your bone that get torn. Remember, your bone is a living organ with nerves and blood vessels in it. It's not just this rigid, dead thing. So much more than that. So first, this hematoma forms. Then a fibrocartilaginous callus forms that spans the break and kind of connects the broken ends. Then your osteoblasts begin forming spongy bone and replacing that cartilaginous callus. And then we go back and do that whole bone remodeling process that we talked about before to heal the fracture. And we're going to do some lab stations that'll go into this process in a bit more detail.